Welcome to Class Time, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE students. I'm Jerome Wright, and I'll be starting you off with CSEC Biology. And the topic for this session is ecology. But before I move into ecology, I want to do a quick recap of last session class. Next slide. All right, so when we met first, we look at classification, and you define classification. We also look at the different types of classification, and who can remind me of the different types of classification that there are? Oh, very good. You have artificial, natural, and you have phylogenetic. And we said with artificial classification, there was some bit of inaccuracies, meaning that organisms were classified and the fact that they look alike. And so we realized that that's not accurate, because as we use the example with the shark and the dolphin, they both have fins, they swim in water, they look alike, but dolphins are mammals and sharks are fishes. We also look at the hierarchy of grouping organisms, and we say that there are mnemonics you can use, like King Philip came over for good soup. So that's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And based on that, we look at common names versus scientific names, where we say that common names can be confusing because what we call an organism in other cultures, it's different. For example, guinea, what we call guinea in Jamaica, they call it ackee in Barbados. And so when you're in a group with scientists and you're referring to an organism, we make known by their scientific name, which is universal. So whether you are from China, Japan, Australia, when you speak of the scientific name, which is made up of the genus and species name, then there's no confusion. We also look at the 5 kingdoms in which organisms are classified into. Right? And we say there are Plantae, Animalia, fungi, protists, right? And we say that virus is no longer Monera, I left out one. That viruses are no longer a kingdom due to the fact that they are not considered to be organisms. Now that we have set the foundation and we have recapped, we can now move on to today's lesson, which is, according to the slide, is ecology. Now, what is ecology? Right. Now, ecology is simply the study of the interaction of living things with each other and also their physical environment. So when defining ecology, we have to make sure that we state that it is an interaction between organisms and the organisms and their environment. And so as we navigate through today's lesson, these are some of the objectives in which I want you to be familiar with. We define ecology as we have done already, and we need to differentiate between some terms that are used in ecology. What do you mean by population versus community? What do you mean by niche versus habitat? And we need to list at least 2 abiotic and biotic factors that may affect living organisms. You also need to be able to explain how a named biotic and an abiotic factor can affect the distribution of species. Now, moving forward, if you're doing ecology, you need to know the terms that are used in ecology, the jargons, the different phrases that are used for ecology. One of these phrases is population. What do we mean by population? When we're talking about population in ecology, we are talking about all the members of a species. I remember I told you last week that it's never species, it is always species inhabiting a given location. So, a group of cockroaches, that's a species. Right? A group of pigs within an ecosystem, that is a population, because it's just one species that is occupying that given location. So it is a population. Now when we talk about community, we are talking about different population occupying that given area. So now you don't have just cockroaches, you have pigs, you have birds, you have fishes, so you have different population occupying that area. So population, we are talking about just one species. Community, we are talking about different population occupying a given location. Now, a species, as we defined last class, is a group of organisms that can interbreed, and not only do they interbreed, but they should produce viable, fertile offspring. And last week we talked about the mule, which is a cross between the donkey and the horse. And because the donkey and the horse is of two different species, the mule is considered to be infertile. Now, some other terms is niche. When we talk about niche, we are referring to the job of the organism within the ecosystem. For example, earthworms, they increase soil fertility when they burrow through the soil. Decomposers, their job is to increase soil fertility by returning the nutrients back to the soil. Plants, their role in the ecosystem is that they provide energy, and they also provide food for the other organisms to feed on. So plants are your producers. So niche refers to the role of the organism within the ecosystem. Like, for example, shrimp, lobsters, those are called scavengers. So they feed and they make sure that the ecosystem is clean by feeding on dead plants and animal matter. Habitat is the place where the organism lives. Right? So there's a difference between niche and habitat. And remember, it's not habitant, it's always habitat. Now, biosphere is that portion of the earth where life exists. Environment refers to anything that surrounds the organism. It can be biotic and abiotic factors, and we'll look into that later on in the lesson. Now, ecosystem involves the interaction between the abiotic and biotic factors within the community and the ecosystem, and how they interact to maintain a balance in the ecosystem. Now we're going to look at abiotic factors, because one of the objectives is to look at abiotic factors and biotic factors and to see how they affect the distribution of species. Now, abiotic factors are those physical factors or chemical factors which affect the ability of organisms to survive and reproduce. Now, some of the abiotic factors are these: light intensity, temperature, amount of moisture, type of substratum, and we're talking about like soil, rocks, and availability of inorganic substances such as your minerals, supply of gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, as well as pH. All those are considered to be abiotic factors. They are the non-living factors within the ecosystem. Now, each of the abiotic factors, they can also be referred to as limiting factors. And these limiting factors, what they mean is that they will dictate what type of organism, or dictates what type of organism can and will survive in that particular habitat. So they are also termed as the limiting factors. And on your screen now you can see two different ecosystems. And this is what I mean by the abiotic factors being the limiting factor within the ecosystem. If you look at the picture on the top, you can see it is very lush, right? A lot of vegetation, a lot of plant diversity. Compared to the picture at the bottom, you can see that there are not much plants. You know, God bless the amount of plants. You can see, you can even count them. Right? Very scanty. Now, can you tell me two abiotic factors that may be responsible for the difference in both pictures? Very good. You can talk about the availability of water. As you can see, the top picture, right? There must be some amount of rainfall. Water is available so the plant can actually grow and flourish. Because, you know, plants need water for photosynthesis. You know, so the plants can grow and look very lovely and nice. So you have a dense network of plants here. So you have an increase in plant diversity. Compare now to the second picture. As you can see, you can look and see that the ground is very thirsty. Look at that, parched. Not much water available. So only those plants who are able to survive in that condition will actually thrive in that condition because there's not much water. So you see where availability of water will dictate to the type of plant that will grow within an ecosystem. So that's what we mean by abiotic factors can be limiting factors. What other abiotic factors you think can cause this change? Very good, you can look at the soil type. From the top picture, you can see that the soil type is very fertile so that it can give rise to all these various plants living there. While the bottom picture, you can see that the soil type is not that fertile, right? Not much plant living there, so it speaks to the fertility of the soil at the bottom. So you see two abiotic factors, availability of water and soil type that can affect plants living within a given ecosystem. And these are some examples of how plants can actually affect, abiotic factors, can actually affect organisms within an ecosystem. So low temperature can affect organisms. The amount of oxygen dissolved in water can affect the species of fish that lives there. Dry environment like the desert will limit the amount of organisms living there, because not all organisms are able to tolerate that harsh condition within the desert. So only those organisms that are able to adapt to that particular environment will survive there. Persons like us will not survive in the desert for very long because our body is not adapted for such harsh conditions. Now, your CSEC syllabus asks us to look at soil as a major abiotic factors, and we will go into that just now. So soil made up of rocks, water, air, and different components, and it provides water, nutrients for plants, as well as it offers anchorage for plants. It's also a home for many organisms like bacteria and fungi. Welcome back. So let's continue. So we are on the topic of abiotic factors, and we're looking at soil as an abiotic factor that may affect organisms living within an ecosystem. So there are different types of soil. Depends on the textbook that you have. It may say 3 types, some say 4 types, but roughly there are 4 major types of soil. The first one is sandy soil, and this soil contains large particles, and so they have a lot of air spaces between those particles. With that large airspace comes the fact that the soil will leach minerals very easily because water tends to drain through very quickly. And as water drains through, it carries also dissolved minerals with it. So those soil particles are very large, and so they are not considered to be very fertile because they tend to lose nutrients often as water drains through those soil. The advantage with sandy soil, however, is that they will not waterlog very easily because they have a very low water holding capacity. What that means is that the tendency for them to hold on to water is very small, so water tends to drain through them very easily. Then we have silt, and silt is basically midway between sand and clay. So they are moderate particles. They're small enough so that they can have drainage problems, but the particles or water can drain through quite easily compared to clay soil. They are normally found near water bodies, and they are also very fertile soil. So farmers tend to use them a lot to plant their crops on that particular soil. Then we have clay soil, and these particles are very, very tiny. And so what happens is that water tends to be held between these tiny particles by capillarity. So they don't drain very readily. So those soils tend to be waterlogged very easily because they have poor drainage. And so it is not the ideal soil for plants to grow on. Then we come to the miracle soil, which all farmers love, and they are normally called the nickname agricultural soil. and that is your loam soil. And loam is a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And so it is a perfect blend for agriculture. It drains easily, it is very fertile, and so on a loam soil, you'll have a greater diversity of plant on a loam soil compared to a sandy soil or a clay soil. So a loam soil is a perfect blend. We compared all the 3 different types of soil, and you form a miracle soil right there. Now, this picture does give an idea of the particle size for sand, silt, and clay. As you can see, for the sand, the particles are large, and so there are a lot of air spaces between them, and so water drains easily. For silt, as I tell you, silt is between sand and clay, and so there are a little bit of air space more than the clay, but not as much as the sand. And so water tends to drain through more easily compared to clay soil. And loam soil now would be a mixture of all 3. Clay soil, as you can see, you can always see the air spaces between the soil particles. Right? So water does not drain readily through clay soil. And there's a lab that you'll do in your lessons where you're going to discover or demonstrate the water holding capacity of 3 different types of soil. Now, the components of soil. Now, soil made up of components, and your CSEC syllabus advises us that you should know at least 3 components of soil and their function. So we have organic matter, and those are your dead and decaying plant matter within the soil. You never hear about the term humus, which is made from dead and decaying plant matter. And what that does is that it helps to increase the fertility of the soil, and it also adds nutrients to the soil and helps with its water holding capacity. You have the mineral components of the soil, which form the skeleton of the soil. Those are like rock particles, right? And what they do is that they help to anchor the plant within the soil, and they also provide the area for water to hold on to in terms of water holding capacity. So they also help to hold water between the particles within the soil. All right, and it gives the soil its texture, the coarseness or the smoothness of the soil. Then you have living organism. Yes, within the soil, there are living organisms. They have bacteria, fungi, earthworms. All those are living organisms within the soil, and they are very much important for the soil. Earthworms, for example, they help to increase the fertility of the soil. As they burrow through the soil, they increase aeration and so improve the soil fertility as well. They have decomposers that helps to break down organic matter and so return nutrients to the soil. Water is another component of soil. And water is important because, 1, it helps plant for photosynthesis. Without water, the plant cannot undergo photosynthesis. As you know, water is a byproduct. Water is a raw material for photosynthesis. So the plant needs water for photosynthesis. Water is also needed in that it prevents the desiccation of soil organisms. For example, the earthworms, their body are soft. So if there's not too much water, you learn about osmosis, so water will tend to move from the earthworm to the surrounding. And so desiccation simply means drying out of the soil organism. Then we have soil air. And in air, we're talking about oxygen. So the oxygen is within the soil, a component of air. So, air is made up of oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. But we are more interested in the oxygen within the air. And this oxygen is very important because, the plant roots are living. And once it is living, it needs oxygen for respiration. More importantly also is that within the soil, you have soil organism, and this organism needs to respire. And so it is important for soil to be very aerated in order for these organisms to survive. That is why when the soil is waterlogged, it is very detrimental for the plant. Yes, plant needs water, but too much water is not good for the plant, because what it does is that it clogs up, so to speak, the air spaces within the soil, so the plant roots cannot breathe. And so the plant roots die, and if the plant roots die, the plant will ultimately die. Now, since we're looking at abiotic factors, we're also going to look at the fact that organisms have so adapted to live within their ecosystem. So they have a way of so-called working around the abiotic factors in order to survive. We can remember the picture I showed you some slides back about the two different ecosystems. You can see even the area that was very dry, you still have plants living there because those plants have adapted to live in that particular environment. And so for plants, they can be classified into 4 groups based on how the water is within that particular habitat. So you have xerophytes. These are plants that can live in areas where there's limited amount of water. And who can give me an example of those areas that have very little amount of water? Right? Yes, like your desert. But in the desert, you still have plants living there because these plants are adapted to live in that particular area. You have halophytes, and these are plants that can live in areas where there's a high amount of salt water. And so the soil type, they were very salty, like your mangroves, which we're going to look later on. Hydrophytes, these are considered to be water plants, so they live actually in water, like your water lilies. And you have the mesophytes. These are ordinary tree plants that you see outside. Look out your window, you see the mango tree, the apple tree. Those are mesophytes. So they live in areas where water is readily available. Not too much, not too little, but just the right amount. Now, for this lesson, I'm going to look at mangroves, which are considered to be halophytes. And there's a program that TVJ is running, I think this Thursday at 8:30, where they're looking at where have the mangroves gone. That is a very good program for you to stay tuned to because it helps you to tell about mangroves and they're important in the ecosystem. So I might tell you to go and stay tuned for that program. It's very much beneficial to you. Now, when it comes down to mangrove occurs in what is called zonation. So at the water's edge, you'll find one type of mangrove, and then as you move from the water's edge, you'll find another type of mangroves and so forth. So they occur in zonation. So at the water's edge, as you can imagine, not much soil. Right? So how do these mangroves manage to live in an area where there's not much soil? Good, they have what is called prop roots. And as you can see on the diagram, there are roots coming from the stem, right, going down. Right? Normally roots are below the surface of the earth, right? But with these plants, you have the roots coming from the stem. And these are called prop roots. And so they help to support the plant. Because remember, one of the functions of soil is that it provides anchorage, helps to anchorage the plant work in accordance with the roots as well. Helps to anchor the plant. So if there's no soil, there's no way the plant can actually anchor properly. So these prop roots helps to keep the plant anchored. Right? And as you know, that's the red mangroves. And as you go inland, you have the black mangroves. And you can see there are some things growing off the black mangroves. And I'm going to go to the whiteboard to show you what I'm talking about. And for those students who have taught before, you know that Leonardo da Vinci really has nothing on me when it comes down to drawing. Right? So this is my red mangrove. Right? And you have the prop roots. So these are roots coming off it. So you have the prop roots. Now as you go inland, you're going to encounter now the black mangroves. And as you can see from the diagram, you have things coming off from the soil. So this is your red and your black. Now these are called new metaphors. Right? And it's quite a big word, but what it actually means is just breathing roots. And why do they need breathing roots? Is that, as you can imagine, it's close to the water's edge. So the soil right there will be very waterlogged. Right? So what happens is that the roots come up in order for the plant to get oxygen, and so help the plant to still survive in the waterlogged soil. So they have what is called pneumatophores, or breathing roots. Further inland, you'll encounter the white mangroves. Right? And how the white mangroves manage to survive under that condition, that particular abiotic factors, which is salty water, is that they too have breathing roots as well, which enables the plants to still allow the plants to get plant roots to get air in the waterlogged soil. Now, how do they overcome the saltiness of the water that they live in, or the saltiness of the soil? Because seawater come and wash up, so of course the soil is going to be high in salinity. What they have is the red mangroves have what is called a sacrificial leaves, sorry. And what happens is that with these mangroves, what they do is that all the excess salt will go into an older leaf. That's what we call sacrificial leaves. So all the salt content, the excess salt that it takes up by the roots, will go into an older leaf. And these leaves will ultimately fall from the plant. And as they fall from the plant, they take along with it the excess salt. Now, the black mangroves have what is called salt glands. And these salt glands, they actively excrete salt from the plant. So all the excess salt that comes up will be removed from the plant by these salt glands on their leaf. And that's for both the black and white mangroves. There's a fourth type of mangrove which is not mainly mentioned, and it's because of the fact that they live further inland, so they are more like our tree plants. So there are not much adaptation for them because they live more inland, and those are called the button mangroves. So the mangroves are capable of adapting to the environment in which they live in, despite the abiotic factors, which is high salt content within the soil, and the fact that there's not much soil, and the soil tends to be waterlogged. So they have the prop roots, which helps to, for the red mangroves, help them to anchor in the water's edge where there's not much soil. You have the red mangroves, the black and white mangroves, have pneumatophores that enables them to live in the waterlogged soil. They also have salt glands on their leaves to get rid of the excess salt. Now, what about animals? Animals are also adapted to live in their environment despite the abiotic factors that might be present. For example, your fresh and saltwater fish. Right? Now, for the freshwater fish, they have to contend with a lot of water being coming into its body by osmosis. Because there are a lot more, the concentration of water outside will be far more than what is inside the organism. So they have to contend with a lot of water coming into the body of the organism. How do they deal with this? Is that they excrete dilute urine. So a large amount of urine, and it is very dilute. Right? So that's how they get rid of most of the water that comes in. They also do not drink the water because already they have to contend with a lot of water moving through the surface of their skin by osmosis. Saltwater fish, if they live in salt water, they are still fresh. Your grandmother testified and said, the Lord keep her like how Jesus keep the fresh fish in the salt water. Yes, that's very true. So if they live in salt water, the fish is not salt at all. And this is because they actively pumped out salt out of their body. So they live in water that is very salty, seawater very salty. So they have to drink water because their body constantly losing water to the seawater because the water concentration in their body will be higher than that in the sea. And when we're talking about water concentration, we're talking about water potential, the amount of ability for water to move up and about. Right. So the water in their body is more dilute than what is in the seawater, I should say. So water is going to move from their bodies to the seawater. And so they have to drink water to compensate for that. But their drinking water comes another problem. The seawater is very salty. How do they get rid of this excess salt into their body? So they actively pump out salt through their gills, and they also produce very concentrated urine. Their urine are very salty, and that's how they get rid of the excess salt within their body. So that's how the fish is able to adapt to their environment, despite the abiotic factors that's there. Right. Now, you also have biotic factors. So biotic factors speaks to the living components of the environment. So abiotic, non-living, like salinity, soil type, pH, temperature, right? All those are abiotic factors, and they play a part in the diversity or the distribution of species within an ecosystem. But we also have biotic factors, which are living factors. And these living factors also plays a role in the distribution of species within an ecosystem. Some of these biotic factors are listed, but are not limited to. You have competition for environmental resources. So that's competition between species. Right? So you have fighting going on. You have availability of food. You have diseases caused by pathogens. And you also have decomposers. All right, so these are some of the, I said it's not limited to these, there are a lot more, but for our time, we just want to look at these few. So when we talk about availability of food, you know, everybody needs to eat, all right? Living in an ecosystem, not much food going around. So they're going to be fighting, competition for food. So animals require food, and food is not infinite. There's finite amount that is available. So if you have a large amount of persons in an area and there's limited food, there's going to be fighting that is going to take place. So organisms are going to compete with each other. Remember I tell you ecology is the interaction between organisms and also organisms and their environment. Right? So species are going to compete for food, and if there's not enough food to accommodate everybody, then there's going to be migration from that particular habitat. Right? If there's a lot of food for everybody, then you're going to find that a lot of organisms or the diversity of species will increase because there's food for everybody. But if there's not enough food, then only those organisms or the alpha organisms, those that can fight and able to defend or whatever, will stay. Those others will migrate to areas where they can find food. Decomposers are very much vital to the ecosystem in that they recycle nutrients within the ecosystem. So they are responsible for returning nutrients to the soil. So when an organism dies, these decomposers act upon them and return the nutrient to the cycles. And later on, when we look at carbon and nitrogen cycle, we're going to see the importance of some of these decomposers. So if there's not enough decomposers within an ecosystem, of course, the soil is not going to be as fertile, and so you'll not see as much diversity in terms of plant growing in that area. Right. And competition between individuals, right, as I said with the food, organisms are going to compete. They're going to compete for water, they're going to compete for space. So a lot of competition will be going on between organisms, and only this fittest will survive. And later on in grade 11, when you do natural selection, you're going to learn about the survival of the fittest. So those organisms that can better able to survive will move on or reproduce, but those organisms that can't really manage that particular environment, of course, is going to leave. Right? So competition between individuals will exist within an ecosystem. And finally, we have predation. So within an ecosystem, if an ecosystem is heavily predated, of course, you're going to have not much organism living there because nobody wants to be eaten. All right? So if a prey knows that, listen, over there, you know, there's a lot of lion and tiger living over there, you know, of course, they're not going to congregate there, you know, because nobody wants to be eaten. And of course, with predation comes also a lessening in terms of the species diversity. So the prey will decrease and the predators increase. And sometimes when it reaches to a point where the predators can no longer find food, they will also migrate. So a reduction in predators can lead to an increase in prey. And with an increase in prey will also comes an increase in predators, because predators are looking for food and prey don't want to be eaten, so they are not going to stay around. Right? They're not going to stay around and wait for the lion to come and eat them. They are going to disperse. So if an area is heavily predated, then of course you're not going to find a lot of prey living there, and so the animal diversity, right, will decrease. Right? So before I recap, we have homework. The last time I was here, students told me that they didn't get any homework. So I'm here to please the masses. So now I have homework. All right, so for the homework, I want you to list 3 methods used by ecologists to should be trapped organism for study. All right, and you need to list 2 methods of sampling and the distribution of organism. You also need to state 2 pros and cons for using any one of the methods listed above. So you're going to list the method that you use by ecologists to study or to sample, 2 sampling methods used by ecologists within the environment or in an ecosystem, and you need to state 2 pros and cons for any one of the methods that you have chosen. All right? And so you need to go and do your research. So somewhat a bit of independent learning going on right there. So to recap, we look at ecology, define ecology. We look at the different terms in ecology. We look at some biotic and abiotic factors and how these abiotic factors affect the distribution of organisms within an ecosystem. Also, we look at how biotic factors as well will affect organisms living within an ecosystem. And both abiotic and biotic factors can be termed as limiting factors, meaning that they play a role and will determine or dictate to the type of organism that will live in a given area. All right, so you can go and review your notes and make sure that you study. All right, now that's it for today's lesson.